There is a feeling that arrives sometimes in the dark. Not fear exactly, not sadness. Something older than either of those. A sense that the world you move through today, the meetings, the traffic, the small negotiations of ordinary life, is not quite the whole story. That somewhere beneath the surface of things, something else is happening. Something you almost know. Tonight, we are going to sit with that feeling, not to diagnose it, not to explain it away, but to follow it gently into a tradition of thought that is more than 2,000 years old, and that speaks with surprising directness to the particular kind of restlessness that shows up at night. You have probably never heard the name Valentinus, but somewhere in the 2nd century, in the city of Rome, a man by that name was teaching ideas so strange, so disorienting, and so quietly beautiful that the most powerful institution in the ancient world decided they needed to be destroyed. They were not destroyed. They were buried. And then, one afternoon, in December of 1945, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging near a cliff in Upper Egypt, near a town called Nag Hammadi, and he found a sealed clay jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound books. Inside those books were texts that had not been read for 16 centuries. Among them, traces of Valentinus. We will get to all of that. But first, right now, let your body settle into wherever it is resting. Feel the weight of your legs, the place where your back meets what is beneath it, the small, steady movement of your breath. You do not need to do anything with what you hear tonight. You do not need to agree with it, or memorize it, or form an opinion. Just let it move through you like water through stone. There is a question at the center of Gnostic thought, and it is the same question you may have carried quietly for years, without quite knowing how to ask it. The question is this: what if the world we see is not the world that is? What if the reality you navigate every day, the one that feels so solid, so given, so obvious, is only the outermost layer of something far stranger and far older? And here is the part that will stay with you. What if the thing that feels out of place inside you is not a problem to be fixed, but a memory of something you have not yet been able to name? Tonight, we sit with the Gnostics. We sit with Valentinus and his vision of a universe layered like an onion, with a hidden god at the center and a broken world at the edge. We sit with Sophia, whose longing cracked the heavens. We sit with the idea that within you, right now, there is something that was never born into this world, only sent into it. And that the restlessness you feel at night might be that something pressing gently against the inside of your ribs, asking to be remembered. Take a breath, slow, if you like, or exactly as it comes. We have all the time we need tonight. The Gnostics believed that most people spend their entire lives in a particular kind of sleep, not the sleep of the body, but the sleep of the soul, the sleep of forgetting. The sleep that comes over a person when they mistake the surface of things for the depth of things, they called the opposite of that sleep gnosis. The word is Greek. It means simply knowing. Not knowing in the way that you know a fact, or remember a phone number. Knowing in the way that you recognize a face. A deep, personal, interior knowing. The kind that changes the one who knows. We will spend tonight exploring what the Gnostics meant by that word. And here is the thread we are going to follow through the evening. There are two kinds of tiredness. One is the kind you feel in your muscles after a long day. The other is a different thing entirely. A tiredness of the soul that no amount of physical rest quite touches. The Gnostics had a great deal to say about the second kind, and by the end of tonight, we will have a name for it. And something in you, something that has been quiet all day, waiting for the world to finally settle down, may find in what follows the shape of a question it has been carrying for a very long time. Let that be enough for now. The first question is the simplest one. What lies beyond what you can see? Not in a threatening way, not as a mystery that demands an answer, but as a door left slightly open on a quiet evening, a light on in a room at the end of a corridor, a feeling that there is something worth moving toward, gently, without urgency, in the dark. That is where we begin. Chapter 2, Why Gnostics Terrified Rome. In the year 180, a bishop named Irenaeus sat down and wrote a book. It was one of the longest books written in Latin up to that point. 5 volumes. Dense, exhaustive, meticulous. The title, translated, was roughly Against Heresies. Irenaeus was not a small man in a small place. He was the Bishop of Lyon, one of the most important cities in the Roman world. He was connected, educated, and genuinely afraid. What frightened him was a collection of ideas being taught in homes and meeting halls across the Mediterranean, ideas that were attracting some of the most educated and searching minds of his era. The ideas came from many teachers, but one name came up again and again: Valentinus. Irenaeus devoted enormous energy to refuting Valentinian teaching. He described it in elaborate detail, sometimes so much detail that historians have had to thank him for accidentally preserving the very ideas he was trying to bury. Let your shoulders drop for a moment. Whatever tension has gathered there from the day, let it soften. What was it about Valentinus that warranted 5 volumes of refutation? The short answer is this. Valentinus was offering people a different story about what the world is and where they came from. Not a story that said, obey and you will be saved, but a story that said, remember and you will be free. He was teaching that salvation was not something you received from an authority, it was something you uncovered within yourself. That the kingdom of God was not above you, waiting for you to earn it. It was inside you, waiting for you to recognize it. You can understand why this was dangerous. An institution built on the idea that it mediates between you and the divine, an institution that holds the keys to the sacred, is threatened to its foundations by the idea that the sacred lives inside every person already. Valentinus was not a marginal figure. Historical accounts suggest he came from Alexandria in Egypt, one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world. He arrived in Rome around 136 CE and became, by some accounts, one of the most respected teachers in the early Christian community. There is a tradition, scholars debate its reliability, but it persists that he was a candidate for the office of Bishop of Rome, the man who would have been Pope. He did not get the position, and so he taught independently. For 3 decades, he gathered students, developed his ideas, wrote poetry and hymns and letters, and built one of the most sophisticated philosophical theological systems of the ancient world. Then the institution turned against him. His works were condemned. His community was scattered. His texts were hidden. Some of them survived, tucked inside the leather-bound books that sat in that clay jar near the Egyptian cliffs for 1,600 years, waiting. There is something quietly moving about that image. Ideas so threatening to power that they had to be buried in the earth. And then, centuries later, rising again, blinking in the light. But we should not romanticize this too quickly. The Gnostics, including Valentinus, were not simple rebels. They were not anti-establishment figures in the modern sense. They were people genuinely wrestling with the deepest questions a human being can ask. Why is there suffering in a world created by a good God? Why does the soul feel, so often, like a stranger in its own body? Why does the world so rarely match the fullness of what the heart seems to remember? These are not ancient questions. These are tonight's questions. Think of the particular version of these questions that belongs to your life. The moments when the world's arrangement seemed not quite adequate. Not a political frustration, not a personal grievance, but a deeper and more persistent sense that the architecture of things is somehow not yet what it could be. That feeling has been with you for a long time. The Gnostics understood it. They took it seriously. They built an entire philosophy around it, and they did not answer those questions with resignation. They answered them with a map of the invisible, a map of where the soul came from, where it is now, and how it might find its way back. That map is what we will be reading together tonight. Chapter 3, The Hidden God Above All. Before anything existed, according to Valentinus, there was silence. Not the silence of an empty room, the silence of pure potential, of something so vast and so complete that it had no need to announce itself. The Gnostics called this original principle by many names: the depth, the unbegotten Father, the invisible Spirit, the One. What mattered was not the name, but the quality. This ultimate source was not a God in the way most people imagine a God, a person with preferences and moods and demands. It was something prior to all of that, prior to thought, prior to distinction, prior to the very possibility of being other than itself. Feel the weight of your body for a moment. Notice the stillness in the room. The Gnostics would have recognized this moment, the moment before you fall asleep, when the noise of the day begins to loosen as a faint echo of that original stillness. Not a perfect echo, but a trace, a memory in the body of a state the soul once knew. Valentinus taught that this hidden God was unknowable in the ordinary sense. You could not approach it with arguments. You could not deduce it with logic. You could not even name it without immediately misrepresenting it, because names create limits, and the first principle had none. This sounds abstract, but there is something deeply recognizable in it. Most people who have lived long enough have had moments where the mind simply stops, where the usual noise of self-commentary goes quiet, where something vast and simple opens up for just a second, perhaps on a long drive or a walk in cold air or in the minutes just before sleep. The Gnostics would say, that is not nothing. That is the nearest thing your ordinary consciousness can come to the nature of the first principle. A glimpse of what underlies everything. Now here is what is unusual about the Valentinian vision of this hidden God. It is not remote. It is not watching from a distance. It is not waiting for you to meet certain conditions. It is, in the deepest sense, what you already are, at the level beneath personality, beneath memory, beneath the whole accumulating story of who you have become over the decades. There is a layer of you that was never born into this world. It was only placed here, temporarily, like a lamp set inside a lantern. We will spend the rest of tonight understanding that image. But hold it gently now. A lamp inside a lantern. The lamp is not the lantern. The lamp came from somewhere else, and one day the lamp will return to where it came from. What Valentinus offered was not a religion in the conventional sense, a set of rules that, if followed, would produce a favorable outcome. He offered something stranger and, to many people in his time, far more compelling. He offered a story that made sense of the feeling that you do not entirely belong here, that the world, for all its beauty and density, sometimes feels like a place you are passing through rather than a place you were made for. He said, "You are right about that feeling, not because life is not worth living, not because the world is not real, but because the deepest part of you carries a memory of something larger than what the world can contain." The philosopher William James, not a Gnostic, but someone who spent his life studying the furthest edges of human experience, described what he called the more, a sense recurring in certain states of consciousness that reality is larger than ordinary waking life reveals, that behind the scenes of what we normally perceive, something else is going on. Something that matters in a way ordinary experience does not quite capture. The Gnostics would have recognized James immediately. They were mapping the territory he could only glimpse. And that memory, if you learn to recognize it, becomes a kind of compass, not pointing north, pointing inward, pointing up, or perhaps pointing to the place where inward and above turn out to be the same direction. Consider what it is like to know something that cannot quite be said. There is a woman in her 60s who has spent most of her working life as a translator. She moves daily between languages, carrying the sense of a sentence from one world of meaning into another. And she will tell you, if you ask her, that there is always something that does not cross. Not the words. The words cross easily enough. But the tone beneath the words, the particular quality of silence that a certain sentence leaves behind in the original language, the resonance that belongs to the structure of that language alone, and that the receiving language can approximate but never quite reproduce. She has learned to love this untranslatable remainder, to sit with it, to let it remind her that meaning is larger than any system capable of carrying it. The hidden god of Valentinus is something like that untranslatable remainder. Every tradition has tried to name it. Every philosophy has attempted to describe it. Every mystic who has encountered it has reached for language and then let the language go, knowing it was never going to be adequate. Not because the thing is vague or uncertain, but because it is more real than the language, not less. The translator understands this better than most. She has spent a career learning what cannot be fully carried. She has learned, slowly and without drama, to let that be a source of wonder rather than frustration. Because what cannot be carried is not therefore absent. It is present in the original, present in the silence the translation leaves behind, present in the ache of the reader who senses that something went unnamed, present, perhaps, in the quiet you are resting in right now. Let your breath be slow. Notice the quality of this particular stillness. The thing that cannot be named is the most reliable thing there is. It is older than any name given to it, older than the world that needed naming. And it is what you are returning to, a little, each time you allow the noise to thin and the deep quiet to arrive. Chapter 4. The Maker Who Isn't Supreme. Here is where the Gnostic map begins to diverge most sharply from the familiar. In most religious traditions of the ancient world, and in most modern ones, the God who created the universe and the God who is supremely good and supremely real are the same being. The Gnostics separated them. They said, the world was made, but it was not made by the highest principle. It was made by something further down the chain, something that thought it was God, but was not. This idea, radical, even scandalous in its time, was not born from cynicism. It was born from a question. Look at the world. Look at the grandeur of it, the way light changes on water, the way forests grow in slow and patient silence, the way a child's face looks in sleep. There is beauty here that stops the breath, and then look at what else is here. The suffering that arrives without explanation, the bodies that break before their time, the way goodness and cruelty seem to share the same sun. The Gnostic question was not, why would a good God allow this? The Gnostic question was, what if the being who made this place was not, in fact, the highest God? What if this world was made by someone who had a limited understanding of what the highest God actually is? Let that settle for a moment, not as a doctrine to be believed, but as a thought experiment, a lens. Because here is what it does. It separates the beauty of the world from the claim that the world is perfect. It allows you to love what is here while still feeling in your bones that something is missing, something is wrong, something is not as it should be. And it does something else, too. It locates the problem not in you, but in the structure of the world itself. The Gnostics were not saying, "You are broken, and that is why life is hard." They were saying, "This world is incomplete, and your sense that it is incomplete is evidence of health, not disease." That is a remarkable reframe. Let your breath come and go without effort. There is a man lying in a hospital ward. He came in for something routine and spent 3 weeks there while complications arose. The room smelled of antiseptic and old air. The lights were always slightly too bright or slightly too dim. One morning, a nurse asked him how he was doing. "I keep thinking I can hear traffic," he said. "And I keep thinking that's the sound of the world out there, still happening, without me." She nodded. She had heard this before. "That feeling," he said, "that the world is going on without you and you are somehow outside it, is that how the Gnostics felt about life itself?" He had been reading. Passing the long hours. She did not know how to answer, but she thought about it later. That is the Gnostic feeling, exactly. The feeling of being in a system that was not built for you, that was built by someone who did not know you existed. And yet, you are here, undeniably, irreducibly, not at the margins of reality, at the center of a much larger reality than the maker of this world was aware of. That lamp, still burning inside the lantern, still warm, still real, still oriented even here, even now, toward the source it came from. Let your body be heavy. Let the surface beneath you carry whatever you are still holding. There is something clarifying about the Gnostic reframe that is easy to miss if you move past it too quickly. The usual religious response to the problem of suffering and imperfection is one of two things. Either God is mysterious and his ways are beyond understanding, so we should trust even when we cannot see, or the world's suffering is the result of human failure and the path forward is to become better. Both of these responses locate the problem in you, in your limited understanding. Or, in your moral failure, the Gnostic response is different. It says, your sense that something is wrong with this world is not a sign of your weakness, it is a sign of your depth. The very fact that you can feel the gap between what is and what should be means you are carrying a knowledge of what should be that this world alone could not have given you. Viktor Frankl, who was not a Gnostic, but who spent 3 years in Nazi concentration camps and emerged with a philosophy of meaning intact, said something that moves in the same direction. He observed that the human being who maintains a sense of dignity, of worth, of the irreducibility of the self, even under conditions designed to obliterate it, is drawing on a reserve that the conditions themselves could not have created. The conditions were trying to reduce. And something in the person refused to be reduced. Frankl called it the last human freedom, the freedom to choose one's own attitude towards circumstances that cannot be changed. The Gnostics would have recognized exactly what he was describing. Not the freedom of a creature who has been given certain permissions. The freedom of a spark that cannot be extinguished by the world that surrounds it, because it is not of that world. It is of the fullness, and the fullness does not yield to the conditions of the Pleroma. Chapter 5. The Demiurge and His Blindness. The Gnostics gave this lesser creator a name, the Demiurge. The word comes from Greek. It means something like craftsman or artisan, the one who works with existing material to make something. Not a creator from nothing, a maker with hands. The Demiurge, in Valentinian teaching, was a being of genuine power. He could create worlds. He could organize matter. He could breathe life into clay. But he was blind to what existed above him. He looked around and saw only himself, and concluded that he must be the supreme being, the highest God, the only God. And so he created the world in his own image, a world shaped by his limitations, his ignorance, his incomplete understanding of what love and goodness actually mean. This is not a story about evil. That is the crucial thing. The Demiurge was not malevolent. He was sincere. He genuinely believed he was doing the best thing, creating the best world he was capable of. But sincerity does not equal wisdom. Good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. And a world created by a being who does not understand the nature of the highest God is, by definition, a world with something missing at its center. Let your jaw soften. The noise of the day is far away now. There is a quality to this Gnostic insight that feels, once you hold it, oddly comforting. We live in a world where the people in authority are often sincere but limited, where systems that govern our lives were built by people who were doing their best with incomplete understanding, where suffering is real, but it is not the final word, because the final word belongs to something that the makers of this world never fully grasped. The Gnostics were not saying, give up on the world. They were saying, do not mistake the world for everything. Do not mistake the craftsman's work for the work of the highest art. Because above the craftsman, or perhaps more precisely, within the material he worked with, hidden in the very stuff of which the world is made, there is something that was never the craftsman's to control, the divine spark. We will come to that. Think for a moment about the people who shaped the world you grew up in. The parents, the teachers, the institutions. They had real power over the conditions of your early life. They made decisions that shaped your experience. They were doing their best. That does not mean their best was complete. That does not mean the story they told you about who you are is the final word. The Demiurge is a symbol, but it is not only a symbol. It is an image of every sincere, partial authority you have ever encountered. Every system built in good faith with incomplete vision. And you, the spark inside the system, were never reducible to what the system could contain. For now, let the Demiurge stand as what it is. The sincere but partial vision of one who mistakes its own perspective for the whole of reality. And then ask yourself gently, where in my own life have I done the same? Where have I organized my small world according to my own understanding and missed the larger picture that was available if only I had looked up? You need not answer that question tonight. Just hold it, like a stone in your hand, something solid and worth carrying. Chapter 6 a cosmos built in ignorance. There is a moment in Gnostic cosmology that has always struck me as one of the most quietly devastating images in the history of ideas. The Demiurge creates the world. He puts it together with considerable skill. Light, water, earth, sky, the long rhythms of seasons, the intricate machinery of living things. And then he looks at what he has made and says, in the language of the tradition, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me." He means it. He is not lying, he is not performing. He simply does not know that above him, before him, beyond the reach of everything he can imagine, the Pleroma exists. The Fullness, a realm of light that makes his creation look like a drawing made by a child in dim candlelight. He does not know because he cannot know. His vision does not extend that far. And so he rules a world built on a foundational misunderstanding. This is not a comfortable image, but there is a kind of strange relief in it. Because if the world's disorder, its beauty alongside its cruelty, its meaning alongside its senselessness, is the product of limited understanding rather than divine intention, then the disorder is not the last word. It is not the decree of the highest principle. It is the work of a craftsman who did not have access to the blueprint. Let your body sink a little deeper into rest. Feel the air moving in and out. A woman had been religious her whole life. Deeply, sincerely religious. She had prayed through grief, through illness, through the slow disappearance of her marriage. She had believed that if she was good enough, steadfast enough, faithful enough, the world would eventually make sense. Then her son died. He was 34. A car, a wet road, a Tuesday in March. And the world did not make sense. She stopped going to services for 2 years. Not out of anger exactly, out of a kind of bewilderment. Then she read something about Gnostic thought, not in a religious context, but in a philosophy class her daughter had taken. She said later, "It gave me the strangest comfort. The idea that the God I had always imagined, the one in charge of everything, the one who let my son die, was not the only God. That above that one, there was something that did not operate according to the rules of this world. Something that my son's spark returned to, somewhere beyond the reach of wet roads and Tuesday mornings." She did not become a Gnostic, but the image stayed with her, like a window opened in a room that had been sealed too long. There is a second thing worth noting about the Demiurge's declaration. When he says, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me," he is not only making a theological error, he is making the error that every limited system makes when it mistakes its own edges for the edges of reality. The error of the person who has never left their hometown and believes the whole world smells like their hometown. The error of the ideology that has never encountered genuine challenge and mistakes its own certainty for truth. The Gnostics were pointing to something that modern thinkers have also circled in different languages, that the greatest source of human suffering is not malice, but limitation. Not cruelty, but the inability to see past one's own horizon. The Demiurge is not the villain of the Gnostic story. He is, in a strange way, its most poignant figure. The being who tried so hard, who had such genuine power, and who could not see that above him, the real story was just beginning. Chapter 7. Archons behind the heavens. Between the Demiurge and the world he created, the Gnostics imagined a series of layers. Each layer was ruled by a being called an Archon. The word means ruler or authority. These Archons were not gods in the highest sense. They were administrators, gatekeepers. Powers that governed specific regions of the invisible cosmos, planets in the ancient cosmological model, each carrying an influence over the soul's movement through existence. The Archons were not simply imaginary. They were images, vivid, specific images for something very real. They were images for the structures of power that limit the soul without the soul being entirely aware of it. Think about the invisible authorities that shape your life, the expectations you absorbed in childhood before you had the capacity to question them, the unspoken rules of the family you were born into, the cultural assumptions about what a man of a certain age is supposed to want, supposed to feel, supposed to become, the voices that run in the background of your thinking, not your voice, but voices you have carried for so long they feel like your own. The Gnostics would have recognized all of these. They would have called them Archons. Let your shoulders drop. Notice the weight of your body. There is nothing to do with any of this right now. The Archons in the Gnostic system were not defeated by fighting them. You did not liberate yourself from invisible authorities by arguing with them or by running from them. You liberated yourself by seeing through them, by developing a vision sharp enough and clear enough to recognize that the voice saying you are not enough is not a divine decree. It is an Archon, a limitation passing itself off as truth. The Gnostic practice of gnosis, of deep knowing, was precisely this: the cultivation of a way of seeing that could distinguish between what is real and what is only powerful. Power and truth are not the same thing. This was the Gnostic insight, and it is as relevant in a bedroom at midnight as it was in Rome in the 2nd century. The thought that wakes you up with that particular weight on your chest at 2 a.m, the one that says you have wasted something or missed something or are somehow behind where you should be by now, that is not a message from the highest principle. That is an Archon. It has the feel of truth because you have been carrying it for so long. But familiarity is not the same thing as accuracy. A thought you have held since childhood can be wrong. A voice you inherited from the people who shaped you can be mistaken. The Archon is powerful. It is not infallible. And the practice of gnosis begins, in the most practical sense, right here, in this moment of quiet attention, in the small act of noticing a thought and asking, is this mine? Or is this something I was given? Acknowledge it. See it clearly. And then look past it, toward the quieter thing. The thing that does not demand, does not compare, does not know what behind means. The thing that simply quietly is. Chapter 8. the divine spark in you. We have been moving through the outer layers of the Gnostic universe, the hidden god, the Demiurge, the Archons. Now we come to the center of it, to you. Not you as your history would define you. Not you as your job title or your failures or your proudest achievements would describe you. But you as the Gnostics understood you at the deepest possible level. They taught that within each human being there is something they called the divine spark, the pneuma, the breath of the original light, trapped inside the world of matter like an ember carried from a fire. Not everyone agreed on who possessed this spark. Some Gnostic groups were elitist. They believed only certain people carried it. Valentinus was more generous. He believed the spark was available to all who were willing to seek it, and that the seeking itself was a form of finding. But here is what everyone agreed on. The spark was not the same thing as the personality. It was not your memories, your preferences, your accumulated opinions about the world. It was something older than all of that. Something that existed before this particular life and would continue after it. Let the next breath come slowly. Feel the place where your hands rest. There is something in this teaching that is difficult to hold with the rational mind and almost immediately recognizable to something else. The feeling, and most people have had it, even briefly, even skeptically, that beneath all the noise of thinking, beneath the story of yourself that you have been telling since childhood, there is a stillness, not absence, not blankness. A presence so quiet it is easy to miss. The Gnostics said, that is it. That is the spark. That is what you actually are, underneath everything else. And here is the part that will stay with you most. The spark does not need to be created. It does not need to be earned. It does not need to be improved. It needs only to be recognized. This is the heart of what the word gnosis means. Not acquiring something new, but remembering something original. A man in his 50s told a story once that has stayed with me. He had spent 20 years building a business. He had been very successful by every measure he understood. He had a house, a reputation, children who were growing up well, a car that people noticed when he parked it. One winter, he went walking alone in the mountains. He had not planned to go far, but the air was clear and the path was simple, and he kept walking until he was 3 hours out from where he had started. And there, in the middle of nowhere, in cold air that tasted like something he could not name, he sat down on a rock. And for a moment, just a moment, he felt something he had not felt since he was very young. He felt like himself, not the businessman, not the father, not the worried and the successful and the capable man, just himself, underneath all of it. He did not know what to call it. He did not need to. The Gnostics would have had a name for it. They would have called it an encounter with the divine spark. And here is what he said when he described it later to someone he trusted. It wasn't a feeling of being better than I usually am. It was the feeling of having stopped pretending that I was less. The spark does not ask you to become more than you are. It asks you to stop pretending to be less. That distinction is the whole of the Gnostic invitation. Chapter 9. Exile inside the flesh. The spark is here, but it is not home. This is the second half of the Gnostic teaching, and it is the part that takes courage to hold. You are not where you started. Not in a literal, geographical sense. In a deeper sense. The spark that inhabits your body came from a realm of fullness and light, and is now housed in a world of weight and friction and decay. The Gnostics called this the exile. They were not being dramatic. They were naming something that many people feel quietly and persistently without knowing how to articulate it. The sense that you are not entirely at home in your own skin. That the world, for all its beauty, doesn't quite fit. That something in you reaches for something the world cannot give. This feeling is not pathology. It is, in the Gnostic view, the soul accurately perceiving its own situation. A woman I once read about had lived in the same city for 40 years. She loved it there. She had friends, she had her routines, she had the particular beauty of that specific patch of earth. But every so often, at a dinner party, in the middle of a perfectly pleasant conversation, she would feel it. A kind of ache. Not for something else, for something more. She had no framework for it. She described it once as grief for a place I've never been. That phrase has stayed with me. Grief for a place I have never been. Let your body settle a little deeper. Notice the stillness around you. The Gnostics would have recognized her grief immediately. They would have said, "You are feeling the distance between where you are and where the spark originates, between this world and the Pleroma." And they would have said something that is both difficult and strangely comforting. The ache is not a sign that something is wrong with you, it is a sign that you remember, even dimly, even without knowing what you remember. The soul that has never experienced the spark aches in a way it cannot explain. The soul that begins to awaken to the spark aches in a way it begins to understand. Both kinds of aching are pointed in the same direction, toward the fullness that exists somewhere above the visible world, toward home. There is a word in Welsh, hiraeth, that does not translate neatly into English. It describes a particular kind of longing, a homesickness for a home you cannot return to or perhaps never had. The Gnostics did not have the Welsh word, but they had the feeling. They built an entire cosmology around it. They said, that longing is not a symptom, it is a compass, and the needle is pointing somewhere real. You may have had this feeling today. In a quiet moment between one task and the next, in the elevator, in the car, the sudden sideways awareness that something important is happening somewhere you cannot quite see. That feeling, the Gnostics would say, is the spark brushing against the inside of the lantern, asking to be recognized, asking gently, persistently, across the whole of a life, do you know who you are? Do you know where you came from? Do you know that the distance between here and home is smaller than you think? Chapter 10. Anxiety in a Fallen Cosmos. Let us talk about anxiety. Not the clinical kind with its checklists and diagnostic categories, something older than that, something the Gnostics would have recognized immediately. The anxiety that comes at night, when the distraction of the day falls away and the mind begins circling. The sense that something is wrong, not specifically wrong, not wrongly in a way you can point to, but that the world itself is somehow not quite right. The Gnostics had a name for the source of this. They called it the deficiency. In their cosmological language, the world we inhabit was created out of something that was itself the product of a rupture, a break in the perfect fullness of the divine realm. The world carries in its very structure the trace of that break, and the soul, sensitive to what is real and what is not, picks this up, not as a thought, not as a belief, as a low, persistent feeling. A sense of unease that has no specific cause. A restlessness that no amount of achievement or accumulation can quite reach. This is not your personal problem. This is the specific condition of being a luminous thing in a world that does not fully accommodate the luminous. Let your breath soften. Let your body be held by whatever is beneath it. There is something quietly revolutionary about this Gnostic reframe. Modern psychology tells us that anxiety often has cognitive roots, distorted thinking, catastrophic interpretation, a hyperactive threat detection system. And that is true and useful. But the Gnostic insight adds something that psychology sometimes misses. Some anxiety is not distorted. Some anxiety is accurate perception. The soul that perceives, however dimly, that it is in a world that does not match its deepest nature, that soul has good reason to feel something like unease. The mistake is in thinking that the unease means something is wrong with you. The Gnostics would say, something is wrong with the world, and your anxiety is the healthy recognition of that. This does not mean there is nothing to do. It does not mean life is hopeless or the world is worthless. It means that the particular form of nighttime unease that has no clear cause, the 3 a.m. weight that descends for no specific reason, might be the soul brushing up against the edges of the cage. Not a breakdown, a recognition. Think about the nights you have lain awake, not because anything specific was wrong, but because something general was not right. The nights that the weight on your chest had no name. The nights where you scrolled through your worries looking for the one that was causing the feeling, and none of them was quite it. That is the Gnostic version of anxiety. The soul correctly sensing the deficiency of the world it is moving through. Not catastrophizing. Not distorting. Accurately measuring the distance between the world as it is and the world the spark remembers. And recognition, the Gnostics taught, is always the beginning of something. The beginning of the path that moves from confusion toward clarity, from forgetting toward remembering, from the exile of unknowing toward the quiet homecoming of gnosis. One slow breath. The rest of tonight will carry us further along that path. Chapter 11, The Heavens as Barriers. In the ancient world, the heavens were not empty space. They were a system, a hierarchy, a series of concentric spheres, each one ruled by one of the Archons we met earlier, each one carrying its own influence and its own particular flavor of limitation. The Gnostic map of the cosmos placed the soul's journey in the middle of this system. You entered the world from above, from the direction of the Pleroma, passing through each sphere, each layer of ruling power, on your way down into the body. And at each layer, the soul was given something, a kind of clothing, a constraint, a way of thinking and feeling and perceiving that was appropriate to that sphere, but that obscured the sphere above it. By the time the soul reached the body, it was wearing many layers of these heavenly garments. It had forgotten almost entirely where it came from. This image of the soul descending and forgetting, clothed in layer after layer of limitation, is one of the most haunting and beautiful in Gnostic thought, because it means that everything you are from the outside, your personality, your habits of thought, your way of moving through the world, is like a coat, many coats, worn simultaneously. Not false, exactly, but not the whole truth. Feel the weight of your body right now. Notice the places where you're in contact with what supports you. There is something beneath all those coats. The question the Gnostics asked, and it is the same question that arrives in certain quiet moments, usually when you are alone and the usual noise has gone quiet, is, what is under here? Who am I when I am not performing any role? When I am not maintaining any image? When I am not trying to be what the world requires? Most people live their entire lives without spending serious time with that question. The Gnostics thought this was the primary tragedy of human existence. Not death, not suffering, but the unlived depth. The person who dies without ever having paused long enough to notice that beneath the coats of personality and conditioning, something extraordinary was always quietly present. Something that was never limited by the Archon spheres, no matter how many of them it passed through, because the spark cannot be diminished by the layers it wears, only hidden, and what is hidden can be found. That is the entire promise of the Gnostic path. There is something the Gnostics noticed about the way the coats accumulate. They do not arrive all at once, they build up over a lifetime. Over the years of becoming a person in a particular place, in a particular time, with particular people making particular demands. Each coat is, in its own way, a reasonable response to the world. The coat of competence, put on in childhood when the world rewarded those who could perform a certain kind of adequacy. The coat of the role, the professional face, the family face, the face worn among strangers. The coat of the story, the accumulated narrative about what happened and who is to blame and what it means about the shape of things, each one fitted to a real need, each one a form of protection that, at some point, made sense. And yet, a man sits in his study after a long day. The house is quiet, his family has gone to bed. He has turned off the lights, except for one lamp on the corner table, and he is sitting in a chair with no book, no screen, no particular intention, just sitting. And in that stillness, something shifts. The coat of the professional falls away. The coat of the father, the husband, the person with opinions falls away. The coat of the man who is managing certain things is no longer being actively maintained. And what is there? In the quiet? He cannot name it. If someone asked him the next morning what he had been doing, sitting alone in the lamplight, he would not have a useful answer. but he knows that something was present that is not usually given space. Something that existed before the first coat was put on. Something that will remain after the last one is removed. The Gnostics would have said, that is the spark recognizing itself. That is Gnosis in its most ordinary, most available form. You do not need a community or a ritual or a text. You need a lamp and a quiet room and the willingness to stay with what shows up when the coats have nowhere to go. Here is the practical shape of this, translated into ordinary life. There is a moment in the day, usually a very quiet moment, usually unscheduled, when the roles loosen. When you are between one thing and the next, when no one is watching and no one is expecting anything, in that moment, what is present? Most people fill the gap immediately. The phone, the task, the habitual thought, but the Gnostics would say, wait there, just for a breath, just for a moment, because that gap is where the coats are thinnest, and what is underneath them is always worth noticing. Chapter 12, What Waits After Death. The Gnostic vision of what happens after death is in some ways the most practical part of their cosmology, because it is not about reward or punishment, it is about the journey of the spark. When a person dies, the Gnostics taught, the soul does not simply vanish, nor does it immediately arrive in some final destination. It moves upward, or rather inward, toward what is more real. Through the same layers of heavenly spheres it passed through on the way down, and at each layer it returns what was given there. The anger acquired in one sphere, the fear acquired in another, the confusion, the pride, the particular flavor of limitation that each Archon impressed upon the soul during its descent. One by one, the coats are removed, and what is left at the end of that journey, if the soul has done the work of recognition while it lived, is the spark in its original form, pure, undimmed, ready to return to the Pleroma. If the soul has not done that work, if it has spent its earthly life entirely identified with the coat instead of the wearer, then it must return, try again, take on another body, another life, another opportunity to remember. Let your breath move at its own pace. Let your mind be as quiet as it wants to be. This is not a framework for fear. The Gnostics were not threatening damnation. They were describing a universe oriented toward return. Every soul eventually finds its way back. The question is only how many lifetimes it takes and how much the journey costs in terms of unnecessary suffering. And the way to shorten the journey, the way to reduce the unnecessary suffering, was, for Valentinus, one thing above all others: gnosis, recognition, the willingness to turn inward, to look past the surface of the personality, to ask, who am I really beneath all of this? There is a story from the Nag Hammadi collection, not from a verifiable historical source, but from the tradition associated with Valentinian circles, about a soul who dies and begins the ascent. At each Archon's gate, the Archon demands, "Who are you?" And the soul, which has done the work of recognition during its life, answers not with a name or a history or a record of deeds. The soul says, "I know what I am, I know where I come from, I know where I am going, and the gates open, one by one, until the spark, finally, arrives where it always belonged. This image, the soul at the gate, the question, the recognition, has a quality that is impossible to explain, and that many people hearing it feel somewhere in the body rather than the mind. A sense of yes. That is the shape of it. There is a particular quality of late-night quiet, the kind you may be moving into right now, that feels to a certain kind of awareness like a small taste of what the Gnostics were describing. The personality is less insistent. The roles of the day have loosened their grip. What is here, in the silence, is something quieter and older than all of that. Not nothing. Something. A presence that does not need to speak to make itself known. The Gnostic said, "Do not let sleep be merely unconsciousness. Let it be a practice. Let the moment of falling away from the day's concerns be a small rehearsal of the larger falling away that every soul eventually undergoes. Let the last thought be a quiet one. Let it be a recognition. You are here, and you are more than here, and whatever is more than here is not lost. It is simply waiting for you to remember it." Chapter 13. Secret Names of Ascent. The Gnostics were not only philosophers, they were also practitioners. They had rituals, initiations, prayers, and a particular practice that may seem strange to modern ears, but that speaks to something deeply human. They memorized names, not ordinary names, names that functioned as passwords, keys to the gates of the heavenly spheres. As the soul moved upward after death, or, in certain advanced states, even during life, it would encounter each of the Archons at the gate of their sphere, and the Archon would demand to know who was passing. And the Gnostic, who had been initiated, would speak the secret name, the word or phrase that demonstrated recognition. Not merely knowledge of a fact, but recognition of a deeper truth. And the gate would open. This sounds mythological. It is mythological. But there is a psychological depth to it that is worth sitting with. What is a secret name? It is, in the language of the Gnostic practice, an acknowledgement of what something really is. To know the secret name of an Archon was to see through its pretension to absolute power, to recognize it as a limited being rather than a supreme authority. And that recognition, that specific act of seeing clearly, was itself the key. Let your body rest. Notice the quiet. Think about the invisible authorities in your own life. The voices that have held sway over you, the inner critic, the perfectionist, the one who says you must be constantly productive, constantly useful, constantly ahead of where you currently are. What would it mean to know their names? Not to fight them, not to suppress them, but to see them clearly enough to say, "I see you. I know what you are. You are not the voice of God. You are a limited power that I have given too much of my energy to. You do not have my secret name." The Gnostics believed the soul itself had a name that the Archons could not speak. a true name, a hidden name that existed only in the relationship between the soul and the highest principle. The soul who knew its own true name could not be held by any Archon. It could pass through every gate. It could ultimately return. There is something in this that resonates in a particular way for people who have spent decades feeling defined by roles they did not choose. The role of the obedient child, the capable professional, the one who holds everything together, the one who does not need help. These are the Archon's names for you. They are not your name. Your name, the deep one, the secret one, is something no institution and no person gave you. It is what you are. It has always been what you are. And the quiet of this moment, this specific moment of settling and softening, of the day loosening its grip, is as close as any practice can bring you to hearing it. The ancient Stoic teacher Epictetus, who was born enslaved and spent his life teaching that the only true freedom is internal, said something that the Gnostics would have recognized immediately. He taught that there is a part of you that no external power can reach, that cannot be commanded, cannot be taken, cannot be owned. He called it the faculty of choice. The Gnostics called it the spark. Different maps, the same territory. The territory of what cannot be named by the Archons because it does not belong to them. And tonight, in this particular quality of quiet, it is present, as it always is. Waiting to be heard. Chapter 14. Christ as Revealer. Valentinus was a Christian, or at least this is important to understand. He understood himself as a Christian. His reading of Christ was simply very different from what would become the official Orthodox reading. For Valentinus, Christ was not primarily a sacrifice, not primarily a king or a judge or a divine being who came to establish rules and institutions. Christ was a revealer. He was, in Valentinian teaching, an emissary from the Pleroma, from the realm of divine fullness, sent into the fallen world to do one specific thing, to remind human beings of what they truly are, not to save them from outside, not to substitute his merit for theirs, but to awaken in them the memory that had been dimmed by layer upon layer of archonic conditioning. He came, in this reading, to hold a mirror. And what the mirror showed was not a sinner in need of redemption. It showed a spark of divine light temporarily inhabiting a world of density and forgetting. He came, one might say, to whisper the secret name. Let your breath find its natural depth. This is not theology in the combative sense. This is an image, the image of someone who arrives in the middle of your ordinary life and holds up a mirror. And the mirror does not show you your failures, your limitations, your embarrassing history. It shows you what is underneath all of that. The luminous thing, the original thing, the thing that looked out through your eyes when you were very young, before the world had taught you to be careful about what you let show. We have all had people like this in our lives, not saviors in a religious sense, but people whose presence, for whatever reason, made it possible for us to be more fully ourselves. a teacher who saw something in you before you could see it yourself. A friend who liked you before you were successful and continued to like you the same way after. A stranger on a train who said something that cut through years of accumulated self-deception and landed, somehow, as truth. The Gnostics would say, these are small versions of what Christ came to do. To hold the mirror. To say, not with words necessarily, but with the fact of their presence, you are more than what you think you are. The revelation Valentinus was describing is not a supernatural event requiring special conditions. It is available in every genuine moment of being seen. Think about the people who have held that mirror for you. The ones who knew you before you became careful about being known. The ones who saw past the competence or the trouble or the image to something quieter and more real. They were offering something the Gnostics would have understood. A small act of gnosis, a brief parting of the fog, and what became visible in those moments, what you felt, however briefly, in the presence of someone who truly saw you. That was not a feeling produced by their approval. It was the spark recognizing itself in the quality of their attention, and it is available tonight. In the quiet, in the falling away from the day's noise, in the small but real recognition that beneath the name the world gave you, something else is present, something older, something true. Chapter 15, Valentinus and the Pleroma. Now we come to Valentinus himself, not just his ideas, but the man. What do we actually know about him? Less than we would like. Most of what survives about Valentinus comes ironically from his opponents. From Irenaeus, who wrote against him, from Tertullian, who argued against him, from Hippolytus, who documented him. These are not neutral sources. They had every reason to distort. But through the distortions, a picture emerges. Valentinus was, by all accounts, a remarkable teacher. Not merely an intellectual, though he was clearly that, but someone who could hold a room. Someone whose voice carried the particular quality of a person who had genuinely encountered something real. He wrote hymns, he wrote poetry, he wrote letters, and what may have been homilies. He wrote, most scholars believe, a text now called the Gospel of Truth, a deeply personal, almost lyrical meditation on ignorance, forgetting, and the soul's return. He was not a cold systematizer. He was a man who had been, by his own account, changed by what he understood. Let your body soften. Notice the stillness in the room around you. At the center of Valentinus's thought was a concept he called the Pleroma. The word means fullness, completeness, the state of having everything that is. He imagined the highest level of reality not as an empty infinity, but as a rich, dynamic, living fullness, populated by divine beings called eons, arranged in pairs, each one a facet of the highest God's nature. Think of it as a kind of divine ecosystem, a world above the world, where the attributes of the ultimate, wisdom, truth, life, understanding, exist not as abstractions, but as living presences. The Pleroma is the opposite of the world's deficiency. It is not what the world lacks. It is what the world is a pale shadow of. And within the spark of each human being, however buried under the weight of the Archons and the coats of the heavenly spheres, there is a direct connection to that fullness. Not a memory of being told about it, not a faith that it exists, a connection, a living thread. Valentinus did not teach this as a theory to be believed. He taught it as a reality to be experienced. The Pleroma was not distant. It was the ground of the present moment, the fullness in which the spark, even in its exile, participates. Every moment of genuine peace, the kind that arrives unexpectedly, that is not the product of anything you arranged, is, in Valentinian terms, a glimpse of the Pleroma showing through the cracks of the world's deficiency. And the crack appears most often in the quiet, in the moment before sleep, in the vast, still space that opens when the day finally relents. The philosopher Plotinus, who lived a generation after the Gnostics and who studied many of the same ancient sources, described the experience of union with the One as something that could not be sought directly. It arrived, he said, when the conditions were right, when the soul had grown quiet enough, still enough, open enough. And then it came, not as a vision, not as a feeling exactly, as a recognition. Valentinus would have agreed completely. You are in that space right now. Something that Valentinus understood about teaching is worth pausing on here. He did not believe that the Pleroma was a concept to be memorized and recited. He believed it was a reality to be recognized. And the difference between memorizing a concept and recognizing a reality is the difference between holding a map and knowing the territory. Many people can hold the map. The map is useful. It orients you. It tells you there is something to look for and approximately where to look. But the map is not the place, and the place, the actual territory, the direct encounter with what the map is pointing at, is available to anyone who is quiet enough and open enough and willing enough to stop demanding that it arrive in the form they expected. Valentinus wrote, or what survives as attributed to him suggests he wrote, in a register that was not primarily argumentative. He was not trying to win a debate. He was trying to evoke something. The gospel of truth, which most scholars believe is his, moves the way certain music moves, building atmospheres, returning to images, layering meaning on meaning until something shifts in the reader that is not reducible to understanding the argument. It is addressed to people who are already sensing the fullness, already aware of the absence, already carrying the ache of the spark that knows what it came from, even if it cannot articulate it. You are in the territory tonight that his writing was designed to evoke. The lamp is still burning. The coats have loosened. The map and the territory are, for a moment, the same thing. Notice the quality of the silence, not the silence of emptiness, the silence of something complete. That is the Pleroma showing through, not as an idea, as a quality of this specific moment. Let your body receive that quality without interpreting it. Let it be what it is. Chapter 16. The Fullness before Rupture. Before the universe existed, before even the universe of the Gnostics, with its Demiurge and its Archons, there was the Pleroma in its original state, unbroken. All the eons in their places, all the divine attributes in their perfect complementary pairs. The highest God at the center, overflowing with something for which love is too small a word. Valentinus described this original state in language that is, even in translation, extraordinarily beautiful. He spoke of silence and depth, of truth and life, of the way the eons existed together in a kind of reciprocal knowing, each one knowing itself through its relationship with the others, and all of them knowing themselves through the ultimate mystery of the first principle. This is the state the spark comes from. This is what the spark remembers, however dimly. Let the next breath be slow. Feel the weight of your body held by the surface beneath you. The philosopher Plotinus, who was not a Gnostic and who actually argued against Gnosticism in several of his works, but who drank from many of the same wells, described something very similar. He called it the One. He taught that all existence emanates from a source of perfect, self-sufficient unity, and that the deepest longing of the soul is not for pleasure or safety or even love in the ordinary sense. The deepest longing of the soul is for return to that unity, not the extinction of the self, the completion of it. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journals about something he called the inner citadel, a part of the self that could not be touched by circumstance, that remained whole even when everything else was in disorder. He was not a Gnostic either, but he was circling the same territory, the territory of what is most real, what existed before the rupture, because the Gnostic teaching includes a rupture. The Pleroma was not always whole. Something happened, something shifted, and out of that shift came the world. We will come to that, but hold for a moment the image of the original fullness. Think about the moments in your own life that have felt most real, not most successful, or most pleasant, or most productive, most real. The moments where everything else fell away and something fundamental showed itself. A conversation that went somewhere surprising and true. A walk in cold air after a long period of indoor life. The exact moment sometimes of falling asleep when the resistance gives way and something much simpler takes over. Those moments, the Gnostics would say, are not interruptions in your ordinary life. They are glimpses of what your ordinary life is interrupting. The state before the rupture, the condition of the spark before it was sent out into the world of density and forgetting. It is not a fantasy. It is not a wish. It is, in the Gnostic understanding, the most real thing there is. And you carry a piece of it right now, in the quiet, in the slow breathing, in the particular quality of awareness that belongs to no role and no history and no achievement, the peace that was never diminished by the journey, only hidden. Think of the night sky on a clear night far from city lights. The stars are not more numerous on such a night than they are from inside the city. The stars are exactly as numerous, exactly as bright, exactly as present. What changes is the interference. The light of the city, which is itself a kind of light, drowns out the deeper light that has been present all along. The Gnostic teaching about the Pleroma works exactly this way. The fullness has not become less full because the world exists. The spark has not become dimmer because it is surrounded by matter and limitation and the competing noise of the Archons. The original state, the condition of the brokenness before rupture, is not damaged by what happened afterward. It is concealed, the way the stars are concealed in a lit city, still there, still burning, still exactly what they always were. A physicist who works at a radio observatory, one of those vast arrays of dish antennae that listen to the sky in frequencies invisible to the eye, described her work once in terms that sound almost Gnostic. She said, "What we are doing is learning to listen past the interference. The universe has been broadcasting since before the Earth existed. Most of what it sends is drowned out by the noise we generate ourselves. Our job is to build instruments sensitive enough to hear through that noise to what was always there." Valentinus would have understood immediately. The Gnostic path is the construction of an instrument sensitive enough to receive the fullness that was always broadcasting, not to create new signal. The signal has never stopped, but to quiet the interference sufficiently that the signal can be heard. Tonight, some of the interference has quieted. The body is heavy, the day is receding, the noise of the ordinary world is at its lowest. You are, right now, one of the better instruments you will ever be for receiving what has always been there. Chapter 17. Sophia's Dangerous Longing. Here is the story that lies at the heart of Valentinian cosmology. The story that explains how the world came to be. Among the eons of the Pleroma, the divine beings who inhabited the fullness, there was one named Sophia. The name means wisdom. Sophia was the youngest of the eons in many versions of the myth. She was also the most passionate, the most moved by longing. And what she longed for was to know the Father directly, not through her consort, as the other eons knew the higher principle through their complementary pair, not through the mediation of the Pleroma's structure. She wanted to know him alone. Without intermediary, she reached, and in reaching beyond what her nature could sustain, she fell. This is not a story about punishment. The Gnostics were careful about that. Sophia's reaching was not evil, it was love, uncontained, it was longing, undisciplined. It was the desire for unity that overreached the means of unity that were available to her. And in that overreaching, something ruptured. Something spilled over the edge of the Pleroma. That spillage, that overflow of Sophia's uncontained longing became the raw material out of which the world was made. Let your body be still. Let that story settle. There is something in it that is not only cosmological. Think of the moments in your own life where longing got the better of you, where you reached for something, connection, recognition, certainty, love, in a way that your situation could not support. Not because the longing was wrong, but because the reach exceeded what was available. The Gnostics were not saying, "Don't long." They were not teaching the elimination of desire. They were describing the shape of what happens when desire moves without wisdom. Sophia longed for the highest, but she moved without her consort, without the paired quality that would have given her longing its appropriate form. The result was a breach, and out of the breach came the imperfect world. This is the Gnostic account of the fall, not of a human being, but of a divine being. And the world we inhabit is not a punishment imposed from outside. It is the consequence of longing that lost its bearing. It is Sophia's sorrow given form. And the Gnostic promise, the thing that Valentinus offered to everyone who came to hear him, was that Sophia's sorrow was not the final word. Sophia was not abandoned. She was helped, brought back toward the Pleroma by the mercy of the highest principle. And through her restoration, the path for the return of every soul was opened. You are not separated from the fullness forever. The separation is real, but it is not permanent, and the longing that aches in you in certain quiet moments, the one that has no object, that reaches without knowing quite what it is reaching for, that is Sophia's longing, still alive in the spark, still oriented, even through all the distance and forgetting, toward the light it came from. Here is what is important about the Sophia myth, beyond its cosmological details. It says that the wound and the wisdom are the same thing. Sophia's longing was not separate from her nature as the eon of wisdom. It was her wisdom in its most intense and unguarded form. The reaching that broke the Pleroma was the reaching that eventually opened the path for every soul to find its way home. The mistake became the means of redemption. That is not a comfortable idea, but it is a true one, and it speaks to something many people who have lived long enough have discovered in their own histories. The loss that broke you was also the loss that opened you. The longing that led you wrong was also the longing that showed you what you were really reaching for. Sophia's fall is not only myth, it is, in miniature, the story of every soul that has ever reached for something real with imperfect hands. Chapter 18, The Birth of Deficiency. When Sophia's longing spilled over the edge of the Pleroma, it did not simply dissipate. It took form. In the Valentinian myth, the overflow of Sophia's uncontained desire became the stuff from which the Demiurge, the craftsman-creator, was made, and through the Demiurge, the material world. This is the Gnostic answer to the oldest question in theology. Where does suffering come from? Not from divine intention, not from human weakness alone, from a rupture in the divine itself, from a moment when love reached beyond its proper form. The world we live in is not the product of cruelty or indifference. It is the product of longing gone slightly wrong. And that reframe changes everything. Let your breath come and go. Feel the stillness gathering in the room. If the world is the product of longing, even imperfect longing, then it is not a mistake to be escaped. It is something more nuanced, something that contains within it the trace of the thing that made it. Sophia's longing was pointed at the highest. Even when it broke free of its proper form, that orientation remained. The world, for all its deficiency, is not entirely cut off from what made it. The spark within matter is the evidence of that. The light that somehow persists even inside the density of the world. There is a Japanese philosophy of aesthetics called wabi-sabi. It finds beauty not in the perfect and the permanent, but in the imperfect and the transient. The cracked bowl repaired with gold. The fallen leaf. The weathered face. It is a philosophy born from a culture that had learned to see the particular beauty of things that have been worn by time and difficulty. The Gnostics were not entirely unlike this. They did not love the world in the way the Demiurge imagined the world should be loved, with reverence for its apparent order and completeness. They loved it the way you love something that is trying, something that carries within it, despite everything, a trace of the fire it came from, a trace of Sophia, a trace of the longing that, in its reaching, made something real, even if imperfect, even if broken, even if the break is precisely what allowed the spark to enter, because here is a thought worth holding tonight. What if the deficiency of the world is not only a tragedy? What if it is also the opening through which something larger is trying to enter? The crack in the cosmic vessel. The place where the light gets in. A man who had worked his whole life in a hospital, not as a doctor or a nurse, but as a porter, moving between wards, witnessing the full range of human experience at its most vulnerable, said something once that has stayed with me. He said, "The patients who seem most at peace are not the ones who have everything sorted. They're the ones who have stopped expecting it to be." He was not describing resignation. He was describing something closer to what the Gnostics meant by acceptance. Not acceptance of the Demiurge's world as the final word, but acceptance of the world's deficiency as the condition within which the spark nevertheless burns. The light does not require a perfect vessel. It requires only a vessel. And you, imperfect and finite and made of Sophia's spilled longing, are precisely that. Chapter 19. The Counterfeit Kingdom Below. The Demiurge, having made the world, ruled it, and the Archons, the powers subordinate to the Demiurge, administered it. The Gnostics had a name for the system they created. They called it sometimes the Pleroma, the emptiness, the place of deficiency, or they called it more simply the world below. Not physically below in the way a cellar is below a house, ontologically below, less real, further from the source. It is a striking designation for the world most of us consider to be the only world. And yet, if you have ever had the experience of something being not quite real, of going through the motions of your day with the uncanny feeling that none of it quite matters, that the whole arrangement is somehow provisional, somehow contingent on something else you cannot see, the Gnostics would say, that is an accurate perception. You are not depressed. You are awake. Let your body sink deeper into rest. Let the next breath be soft. But the Gnostics did not stop at the recognition of the world's unreality. That would have been nihilism, and Valentinus was not a nihilist. He went further. He said, yes, the world below is not the highest reality, but within the world below, something from the highest reality is present, hidden but present. The spark, the pneuma, the tiny piece of the Pleroma that the Demiurge, without knowing it, enclosed within the human being when he created us. He did not intend it. He was working with material he did not entirely understand. But in his very act of creation, he enclosed something divine inside his creation, something that, by its very nature, cannot be held forever, cannot be owned, cannot be ruled by the Archons, because it belongs to a realm they have no access to. Think of it this way. A craftsman builds a lamp. He is proud of the lamp. He hangs it, rules over it, decides when it is lit and when it is extinguished. But he does not make the flame. The flame comes from elsewhere. And the flame does not belong to the lamp or to the craftsman. The flame belongs to the fire it came from. That is the spark inside you. The Demiurge made the vessel, the highest principle without intending it, simply because the material from which Sophia was made always carries a trace of the Pleroma, breathed the flame. The counterfeit kingdom below is very real as a system of limitation and constraint. But it is not the only reality you contain, not even close. And here is the thing about the counterfeit kingdom that the Gnostics understood with unusual precision. It sustains itself through the soul's agreement. It does not imprison by force. It imprisons by the soul's belief that the prison is all there is. The moment the soul begins to question that belief, the moment it asks, even quietly, whether there might be something the kingdom has not told it, the walls begin to thin. Not by fighting, not by rejection, by seeing, by the simple, powerful act of a consciousness that has remembered there is more. That is what tonight is. Not an escape from the counterfeit kingdom, a remembering that you are never only its citizen. Chapter 20, Why Most People Sleep. And if your mind has been drifting, that is perfectly fine. Come back gently, we are still here. We have been speaking of the Gnostic map, the Pleroma above, the Kenoma below, the spark hidden inside. Now we come to the question that was, for Valentinus, the most pressing question of all. Why, given that the spark is present, given that the divine light is right here inside every human being, why do most people never seem to notice? Why do they live their entire lives identified with the coat instead of the one wearing the coat? The Gnostics had an answer, and it is the answer that gives this chapter its title. They are asleep. Not in the physical sense, in the deeper sense. The Gnostic understanding of sleep was this. Most people spend their lives inside a set of stories. Stories they were given by the world, by their culture, by their families, by the Archons, and they have become so comfortable inside those stories that they have forgotten they are stories. They have forgotten that below the story, something else is present. The story says, you are your job, you are your reputation, you are your body, you are your history, you are the sum of your successes and failures. And the soul, listening, nods. Yes, I suppose I am all of that. And the spark underneath Wait. Let your jaw soften. Notice the weight of your body. The Greek word for this condition was agnoia, ignorance, but not the ordinary kind of ignorance, not the ignorance of someone who simply has not learned enough facts. This was a deeper ignorance, the ignorance of a person who does not know what they do not know, the ignorance of a man who has never left his hometown and therefore cannot feel the absence of the wider world, the ignorance of someone who has never heard music and therefore cannot feel the silence where music would have been. This kind of ignorance is not cured by information. It is cured by experience, by a moment, however brief, however unexpected, of encountering something that cannot be contained in the story, a moment where the story breaks down, and the thing underneath becomes, for just an instant, visible. The Gnostics called the people who had not had that encounter the helics, from the Greek word for matter, the ones who were entirely identified with the material level of existence. They called the people who had had some partial intuition of the deeper reality the psychics, from the word for soul, the ones who had a sense that something more was present but had not yet penetrated to the core, and the people who had fully recognized the spark, who had, in the Gnostic sense, awakened, they called the pneumatics, the ones alive to the breath, the spirit, the flame. Valentinus believed these were not permanent categories, not fixed classes of humanity. They were stages, states, levels of recognition that could shift. The Hylic could awaken. The awakening took a specific form, and it was not primarily intellectual. It was the recognition of the spark, a moment of knowing that you are not the story the world told about you, that there is something here in the quiet of this moment, in the space behind thought, that was never the world's to define. Think about the people in your life who seem most fully awake, not necessarily the most successful or the most confident or the most admired, the ones who seem in some way at home in themselves, the ones whose presence has a quality of settledness that has nothing to do with having solved all their problems. The Gnostics would say, those people have found the thread. They may not know to call it the spark. They may not have a name for it at all, but something in them has recognized something, and that recognition is quiet but unmistakable. You have been moving toward it tonight. Chapter 21. Ignorance deeper than sin. In Orthodox Christianity, the tradition that eventually won the argument against Valentinus, the central problem of human existence is sin. The act of rebellion against divine law, the willful choice of the lower over the higher. For Valentinus, the central problem was different. It was not sin, it was ignorance. Not ordinary ignorance, not the failure to learn something you should have learned, but the ignorance of a person who does not know what they are. The Gnostics believed that most of the behavior that produces suffering, the cruelty, the small-mindedness, the compulsive seeking after comfort and recognition, the way human beings routinely choose the near and tangible over the true and lasting, was not the product of wickedness. It was the product of forgetting. People do what they do because they believe they are what the story says they are. And a person who believes they are only their personality, only their name, only their history, only their body, will naturally seek the things that seem to match that belief. Comfort, security, status, the temporary relief of feeling, for a moment, like enough. But none of those things can reach the spark. None of them can fill the Gnostic hole. Because the whole is not shaped like an achievement or a relationship or a possession. It is shaped like the Pleroma, and nothing short of the Pleroma or the recognition that a thread connecting you to the Pleroma exists can fill it. Let your body be at rest. Let the breath be easy. A man who had been very successful in his working life, who had risen high in his field, who had a house and a marriage and a calendar full of important meetings, retired at 62. He had expected to feel free. Instead, for the first month, he felt nothing. Not depressed, exactly. Just flat, like a stage set, with all the performance removed. He told his doctor he thought he might be ill. His doctor asked him, "What did you think you would feel when all the striving stopped?" He said he had assumed he would feel at peace. His doctor said, "And what if the peace you were imagining was always underneath, and the striving was just the thing that kept you from noticing it?" He sat with that for a long time. The Gnostics would have recognized his situation immediately. He had spent decades inside the story of the important man with the important career, and the story was not false. But it was not the whole truth. The peace he was looking for was not on the other side of the career, it was underneath it. It had always been underneath it. The ignorance, the deep Gnostic ignorance, was his conviction that the peace was something he would eventually arrive at, not something that had always been present, waiting, patient. Exactly as real as the spark in the Gnostic lamp, this is the second kind of tiredness we mentioned at the beginning of our evening. Remember? Two kinds of tiredness. The first is the tiredness of the body. The second is the tiredness of a soul that has been seeking something it cannot name in all the wrong places. The tiredness of decades of searching for fullness in a world of deficiency. That tiredness is not weakness. It is the most honest response a human being can have to the condition the Gnostics described. And the good news, the genuinely good news, is that the tiredness is also a signpost. It points away from the search and toward the recognition, away from acquiring more toward noticing what is already here. Chapter 22. Mental Clarity as Remembrance. The Gnostic path was not a path of belief. Valentinus was not asking his students to accept a doctrine on faith. He was asking them to look, to see, to remember. The Greek word gnosis, the word that names the entire tradition, does not mean information received. It means recognition of what is already known, like remembering a dream, like recognizing a face. It is a turning towards something that has always been present, not a turning towards something new. And what you remember in the Gnostic sense is not a fact, not a piece of theological data. You remember yourself. The self that existed before the descent through the Archons' spheres, the self that wears the coats but is not the coats, the spark, Let your breath be slow. Notice the quiet that is gathering. This is the reason Gnostic practice was, in many of its forms, a practice of interior attention, not exterior action, not ritual performance, not the accumulation of virtue points. Simply looking inward, with patience, with care, with a willingness to sit with what you find until the surface gives way and something more fundamental becomes visible. The mystical traditions of virtually every culture have described something similar. The Sufi concept of fana, the passing away of the ego self to reveal the divine nature beneath. The Buddhist notion of anatta, not self, the recognition that what you thought you were is a construction, and what you are beneath the construction is open and clear. The Christian mystical tradition of kenosis, the emptying of the self to make room for the divine. Different languages, different maps, the same territory. Valentinus was mapping that territory in the 2nd century in Rome, in the language of Greek philosophy and early Christian thought. And the map he drew was detailed, beautiful, and, in its essentials, consistent with what the most careful interior explorers of every tradition have reported. The truth is not out there. The truth is in here. And the way to it is not through more information, or more striving, or more accumulation. The way to it is through subtraction, removing what is not you, layer by layer, coat by coat, until the spark stands clear, not acquired, remembered. There is a particular kind of mental clarity that arrives, sometimes in a state of genuine quietness. Not the forced clarity of concentration, not the manufactured clarity of analysis, the organic clarity that comes when the noise stops and something simple shows itself. You may have experienced this tonight. A thought that arrived with unusual weight, an image that seemed to belong to something larger than your own mind. The Gnostics would not call that coincidence. They would call it the spark, recognizing itself in the conditions that allow it to be seen. Mental clarity, in the Gnostic frame, is not an achievement. It is a remembrance. The mind clearing of what it borrowed. And what remains in the clearing is the original. Chapter 23, The Body as Borrowed Garment. The Gnostics had a complicated relationship with the body. On one hand, they were suspicious of it. The body was the densest, most material layer of the coats the soul wore, the layer most thoroughly shaped by the Demiurge and his Archons, the layer most effectively concealing the spark. On the other hand, Valentinus himself was not an extreme ascetic. He did not teach that the body was evil, to be punished or starved into submission. He taught that the body was borrowed, a garment taken on for the duration of this life, real while you wear it, but not who you are. This is a genuinely strange thing to try to hold. You are in a body right now. You feel its weight, its warmth, the specific sensations of your particular physical existence in this particular moment. And the Gnostics say, yes, all of that is real, and none of it is who you ultimately are. Let your attention move, just for a moment, to wherever your body feels heaviest. Maybe your legs, maybe the back of your head against the pillow. You do not need to change anything. Just notice. The body is not your enemy in Valentinian thought. It is more like a temporary home. You inhabit it, you tend it, you live through it. But you do not mistake it for the self that inhabits it. There is a metaphor that recurs across many wisdom traditions: the wave and the ocean. The wave rises, moves, breaks on the shore, and returns to the sea. It is real while it lasts. It has its particular shape, its particular motion, its particular moment of existence, but it was never separate from the ocean. Even at the height of its rise, it was only the ocean, taking a temporary form. The body is the wave. The spark is the ocean. And the ocean does not end when the wave breaks. This is not a comforting metaphor in the way that simple reassurance is comforting. It requires something of you, a willingness to hold the paradox of being fully in the body while not being only the body. But it offers something that simple reassurance cannot. It offers a framework for the feeling that you are somehow larger than your circumstances, that your life, for all its weight, does not contain everything you are. The Gnostics did not invent this feeling. They simply named it, and they built a cosmology around the possibility that the feeling is not wishful thinking. It is accurate perception. The spark knowing itself in the borrowed garment. The ocean recognizing itself even through the temporary shape of the wave. Bessel van der Kolk, the psychiatrist who spent decades studying how experience is held in the body, made a discovery that would have surprised few Gnostics. He found that the body carries things the mind does not know it is carrying. That the events of a life are encoded not just in memory, but in posture, in breath, in the tightness of certain muscles, in the way a person holds themselves in a room. The body remembers. The Gnostics would have said, yes, of course, the borrowed garment holds the shape of everything the wearer has been through, but the wearer is not the shape the garment holds. Beneath whatever this body has been through, beneath its history, its tightness, its accumulated weight, the spark is unchanged, still burning, still real, still connected by a thread that neither time nor suffering can sever to the light it came from. Chapter 24, Suffering in a Broken Order. Suffering, in the Gnostic frame, is not punishment. It is not the consequence of personal failing. It is not evidence that God does not love you. It is the texture of living in a world that was made by a craftsman who did not have the full blueprint. This does not make suffering less real. The Gnostics were not asking you to pretend. Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz and spent the rest of his life thinking about what gives a person the strength to endure the worst, wrote that the deepest need of the human soul is not for comfort or pleasure, it is for meaning. He was not a Gnostic, but he was circling something the Gnostics understood. The soul can endure almost anything if it can find a frame that makes sense of it. Not a frame that justifies suffering. Not a frame that says suffering is good, or deserved, or necessary. But a frame that says your suffering is not the final word on who you are. Your suffering is not proof that you are abandoned. It is proof that you are in a broken order, and that the light inside you, the thing that feels the wrongness, the thing that resists, The thing that reaches for something better is not itself broken. Let your breath come easy. Let your body be held. A woman who had been diagnosed with a serious illness and was going through the worst year of her life said something that has stayed with me. She said, "The illness is not me. The illness is happening to me. There is a part of me that is watching all of this and is somehow okay." She was not performing equanimity. She was not pretending. She was accurately perceiving the difference between the body's suffering and the spark's undiminished nature. The body breaks. That is the Gnostic world, the world of the Demiurge, where decay and loss and impermanence are built into the structure. The spark does not break. It was never made of the material that breaks. And the particular kind of suffering that comes from knowing this, the suffering of a luminous thing in a dim world, is not pathology. It is, in the Gnostic vision, the ache of recognition. The spark knowing what it is and knowing where it is. Both things simultaneously. And that double knowledge, that capacity to feel the weight of the world without losing the thread that connects you to what is above it, that is, for Valentinus, the beginning of everything, the beginning of the path back. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius from the fading world of Roman privilege, made a distinction that the Gnostics would have recognized. He wrote that it is not what happens to us that determines our state, but what we carry inward. He was not a Gnostic, he was a Stoic. He believed in a providential order that the Gnostics would have attributed to the Demiurge rather than to any ultimate principle. But his insight holds across the cosmological difference. The suffering that comes from the outside is real, but the response to that suffering, the quality of interior life that meets it, is something else entirely. That quality is the spark's domain, not the Demiurge's, not the Archons, yours. And no amount of suffering imposed from outside can determine what you do with what is inside. The spark persists. That has always been the Gnostic promise. And it is not less true tonight than it was in the 2nd century in Rome when Valentinus first spoke it into the darkness. Chapter 25, Inner Peace Beyond Matter. There is a scene in the Gospel of Truth, the text that many scholars believe Valentinus wrote himself, that has always seemed to me one of the most beautiful passages in ancient literature. It describes ignorance as a fog that settled over everything, that made people stumble and grope, that caused them to take the shadows of things for the things themselves, that left them afraid and grasping and deeply, profoundly alone. And then the fog lifts. The text does not say when, it does not say how, it only describes the quality of the light when it arrives. And what comes across, even in translation, is not triumph. It is relief. The quiet, expansive, almost unbearable relief of finally seeing clearly. Let your body be still. Let the breath move on its own. The inner peace the Gnostics described was not the peace of having solved all problems. It was not the peace of having arrived somewhere, of having accumulated enough, of having at last achieved what you were striving for. It was the peace of a particular kind of recognition. The recognition that what you were always searching for was never at the end of the search. It was in the searching. in the quality of attention you brought, in the willingness to look past the surface of things, past the noise of the Archons, past the story the world told you about who you are. The peace is the recognition that you are not, at the deepest level, the person the world has been addressing. You are the spark, and the spark has never lost its connection to the Pleroma, not even in the deepest exile, not even in the darkest night, not even now. This is not a promise that everything will be fine. The Gnostics were not naive. The world below is still the world below. The Archons still have their authority in the material realm. Life is still difficult and finite and full of losses that cannot be recovered. But within all of that, at the same time as all of that, something is untouched. Something that the Demiurge did not make and cannot unmake. Something that exists quietly and completely in the space between your thoughts. In the moment before the next thought begins. Right here, right now. Think about what it would mean, not as a concept, but as a feeling, to be at peace, not because everything is resolved, but because something beneath everything is secure. The peace that passes understanding, as one ancient text puts it. Not the peace of resolution, the peace of ground. The ground that holds you not because you have earned it or arrived at it, the ground that was there before you started searching. That will be there after the search is complete. The Gnostics named it the Pleroma. You may name it differently. Or you may find that the feeling of it, the specific quality of this late-night settling, this loosening of the day's grip is enough. Without a name, just the thing itself. No name required. No arrival needed. Present, real, available. Here in the quiet that is gathering. There is a Stoic practice familiar to Marcus Aurelius of returning at the end of each day to the essentials. Not reviewing what was accomplished, not cataloguing what was left undone, but returning briefly to the question of what actually mattered. What of everything that happened today was real? What was noise? What was performance? What was the layer of Archon-shaped urgency that arrived dressed as necessity and departed leaving nothing? The Gnostics practiced something similar, but with a different orientation, where the Stoic asks what was genuinely within my control, the Gnostic asks what was genuinely me. Not what role was I playing, though that is part of it. What was the deepest agent in this day's events? What in me was actually present as opposed to performing? Where did I act from the level of the coat, and where, if anywhere, did I act from something closer to the spark? You do not have to answer this tonight. In fact, tonight is not for answering. Tonight is for allowing the accumulated layers of the day to settle and thin, the way silt settles in still water. By morning, the water will be clearer. The clarity is not something you make, it is something that happens when you stop stirring. The inner peace that lies beyond matter is not the peace of someone who has solved the problem of the world. It is the peace of someone who has, for a little while, stopped needing the problem to be solved, and found that beneath the unsolved problem something was always quietly complete. Chapter 26. Loneliness of the Awakened. The Gnostic path is not easy. It would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. Because the person who begins to recognize the spark, who begins to see past the stories the world tells about who they are, often finds themselves in a peculiar kind of solitude. Not the loneliness of social isolation, but the loneliness of a particular kind of seeing. The loneliness of someone who can no longer be entirely comfortable in the conversations that used to sustain them, the conversations that are entirely about the surface of things. The weather, the politics, the small negotiations of ordinary life, things that still matter, still require attention, but that no longer feel like they are the whole of what life is. The Gnostics wrote about this. They recognized that awakening brought with it a kind of displacement, not superior displacement, not the smug distance of the person who thinks they have figured out what everyone else has missed, but the quiet ache of someone who has touched something real and now finds it difficult to forget. Let your shoulders drop. Notice the weight of your hands. Michel de Montaigne, the French philosopher who in 1571 retired to a stone tower in Bordeaux surrounded by his books after years of public life, described something similar. He said he could no longer entirely pretend in social settings that the things people most urgently discussed were the things that most urgently mattered, not because he thought himself better than anyone, but because his attention had been trained by years of interior work to keep pointing toward something deeper. He found that the tower, the solitude, was not a punishment, it was a necessity. Not forever, not as a rejection of the world, but as a regular practice of return to what was real. The Gnostic teachers built communities for precisely this reason. The person who is beginning to awaken needs companions who understand what they are experiencing. Not to be confirmed in their sense of superiority, because that would be its own form of Archon, the Archon of spiritual pride, but to be companioned in the difficulty of holding two worlds simultaneously, the world of ordinary life, the world of relationships and bills and bodies that need tending, and the world of the spark, where none of the usual categories apply. Most people manage one world or the other. The Gnostic path is to live in both, to be fully present to the ordinary world, with all its weight and beauty and demand, and to carry, at the same time, the knowledge of the spark, like a lamp you never set down, even in the dark, especially in the dark. The particular loneliness of the awakened is, in its deepest form, not loneliness at all. It is the solitude of the spark, recognizing its own nature. And solitude of that kind is not the absence of connection. It is the most fundamental form of connection, the connection between the part and the whole, the flame and the fire, the wave and the ocean. The Gnostic tradition understood that this connection could sustain a person through a great deal of outer isolation, because the person who knows the spark is never entirely alone. They carry, in the deepest interior, something that does not require company. Something that was present before the first person spoke to them and will be present after the last. The lamp they never set down, still burning in the quiet of this particular night. There is a specific quality of late-night solitude that the Gnostics would have known well. The hours between midnight and early morning. The hours when the world's ordinary traffic has stilled. When the particular noise of daylight, the phones, the voices, the thousand demands that pass themselves off as urgency, has finally quieted enough to hear what was underneath it all along. Many contemplatives across many traditions have noted that these hours have a different quality from the daytime quiet. Not just quieter, different in texture, as though something in the collective silence of sleeping people thins the interference, as though the spark, surrounded by other sparks temporarily released from their daily performances, can feel itself more clearly. Viktor Frankl described the deepest solitude he encountered in the concentration camps. Solitude that had nothing to do with being alone, since he was surrounded always by other prisoners, as a kind of interior space that no external condition could enter. He would stand in the early morning, before the day's forced labor began, and look at the sky. And in that looking, something in him was neither prisoner nor prisoner's number. Something that had nothing to do with the camp or its rulers was quietly, undefiantly present. He did not call it the spark. He did not use the Gnostic vocabulary, but he was describing the same thing, the part of you that the Archons cannot reach. Not because you have fought your way past them, not because you have achieved some elevated state of consciousness that places you above the ordinary conditions, but simply because that part of you was never subject to them in the first place. It was carrying them, in a sense. It was the deepest context in which the Archon's authority operated, and it remains. Below all that authority, below all the accumulated layers of the world's demands, still burning, in the quiet of this particular night, with everyone else in this city, this country, this world, who is also, in their own way, by their own path, trying to find their way back to the same thing. Chapter 27. The Bridal Chamber Mystery. Among the rituals the Valentinian community practiced, the most sacred was called the Bridal Chamber. The name comes from the Gospel of Philip, another of the Nag Hammadi texts closely associated with Valentinian thought. The bridal chamber was not a place, it was a state of union between the soul and its divine counterpart. A moment of recognition so complete that the distance between the soul and its source collapsed. The image is intimate, deliberately so. Valentinus believed that the soul's relationship to the divine was not primarily one of servant to master or subject to king. It was, at its deepest level, a relationship of love. Not romantic love in the ordinary sense, something older and larger than that. the love of a thing for its source, the love of the wave for the ocean, the love of the light for the fire it came from. This is the love that the bridal chamber ritual was designed to evoke, to create a container in which the soul could, however briefly, experience the quality of its relationship to the highest principle, not as concept, as felt reality. Let your body be soft. Let the breath be as quiet as it wants to be. The mystics of many traditions have used the language of marriage, of union, of the beloved, to describe the experience of the deepest encounter with the divine. The Song of Songs in the Hebrew Bible, the poetry of Rumi in the Sufi tradition, the writings of John of the Cross in the Christian mystical tradition, all of them reaching for the same impossible articulation. The moment when what is most real in you meets what is most real in the universe and recognizes itself, because that is the nature of the bridal chamber mystery. Not a meeting of two separate things, a recognition of what was always one. The soul is not separate from the divine principle, waiting to be reunited with something external to itself. The soul is, at its core, already of the divine substance. The recognition is not a merging, it is a remembering. The moment of the bridal chamber is the moment when the forgetting ends. When the spark looks up from the borrowed garment and says, I know this light, I came from this, and the highest principle, in a way that cannot be put into words, says, yes, you have always been here. The Valentinian community gathered for this ritual. They prepared. They entered the space together, because the presence of others who were also seeking made the atmosphere more conducive, more permeable. The mystic traditions of many cultures have understood this, that the conditions we create for recognition matter, that solitude and community each play their role, and that tonight, this particular quality of late-night quiet, this space between the day's noise and the silence of sleep, is its own kind of bridal chamber, not a formal ritual, but a condition, a moment when the ordinary categories have loosened enough that something more fundamental might show itself. If you are willing to be still long enough, if you are willing to not fill the quiet with something else, just for tonight. There is a teaching that runs through the mystical traditions of many cultures, one that the Valentinians would have recognized, that says the conditions of the encounter cannot be forced, but they can be tended. You cannot make the bridal chamber happen, but you can prepare the room. What preparation looks like varies from person to person. For some, it is silence. For others, a particular quality of attention, the kind that is soft rather than hard, receptive rather than grasping. For others still, it is the simple act of relinquishing for a little while the need to achieve anything at all. The Valentinian community understood that together, a group of people in a shared intention could create a field that made the encounter more likely for each individual within it. Not because the divine principle required an audience, but because the self requires permission, and sometimes the permission of other seekers is what allows the individual self to finally exhale, to set down the performance. to stop trying. There is a man who attended a meditation retreat for the first time at the age of 53. He went with low expectations. He had tried various practices over the years and found them useful but not transformative. He had read widely, thought carefully, and arrived at a thoughtful uncertainty about what, if anything, underlay ordinary experience. On the third day of the retreat, sitting in a hall with 60 other people in near total silence, he noticed something change. Not a vision, not a feeling of expansion or light, or the usual furniture of mystical narrative. Just a quality of presence that was different from what he had always taken presence to be, as though something that was usually performing had stopped, and what remained was simpler and larger and very, very quiet. He described it later, inadequately, as the sense that the room was larger on the inside than the outside. The Valentinians would have said, "Yes, you found the bridal chamber, not in a ceremony." In the silence of 60 people who had collectively agreed to stop insisting on the usual reality long enough for another reality to be recognized. You are in that space now. The permission has been given. Chapter 28. The Gospel of Truth. Among the texts found at Nag Hammadi, one stands apart in terms of its literary quality. It is called the Gospel of Truth. It does not read like a narrative gospel. It does not tell the story of a historical figure's life and teaching. It reads like a meditation, like a poem, like the private notes of someone who has encountered something very large and is trying carefully to find words for it. Scholars have debated its authorship for decades. Many believe Valentinus himself wrote it, or that it represents his teaching very directly. What is certain is that it is unlike anything else in ancient religious literature. It begins with the idea of ignorance as a fog that settled over the Pleroma when the Father was not known, and the fog produced terror, and the terror produced a kind of amnesia, and the amnesia produced the world. Then the fog lifted, and the Gospel of Truth becomes, at that point, almost incandescent. It describes the joy of remembering, the joy of the sheep that was lost and found, the joy of the person who, in the middle of an ordinary day, discovers that what they were looking for was never not there. Let your breath be slow. Let the quiet gather. The Gospel of Truth speaks of the name, the Father's name, not as a magical word, but as the quality of a reality that cannot be held at arm's length, can only be received. It says something that has stayed with people across many centuries. It says the Father is perfect. The Father's perfection is not his remoteness, it is his nearness. His nearness is not his smallness, it is his completeness. And the soul that comes to understand this, that the highest principle is not distant, but simply not yet recognized, is freed. Not from the world, not from the body, but from the weight of thinking itself separated. Because the most fundamental suffering the Gnostics identified was this: the experience of being cut off from the source, the experience of exile. And the Gospel of Truth says, the exile is real in experience, but it is not real in truth. You were never actually cut off. The thread was never severed. The fog made it seem so. But the fog was never the whole of what is. Beneath the fog, always, patiently, without urgency, the light was present, is present, here, now, in the quiet of this moment. The scholar Elaine Pagels spent decades studying these texts. She found in them something she had not expected from what were supposed to be heretical and marginal writings. She found genuine spiritual depth, the kind of depth that does not simplify the human condition into a transaction. Do this, believe that, receive this outcome. The kind of depth that sits with the full complexity of being a conscious creature in a world that does not always make sense, and the kind of depth that still, somehow, offers something. Not a guarantee, not a certainty, but a direction, inward, upward, toward the recognition that the fog was never the whole of what is, that the exile was always simultaneously a return waiting to happen, and that the Gospel of Truth is, in its strange and beautiful way, your story, the soul that forgot, and then, in the quiet of a certain night, began to remember. What Valentinus offered in the Gospel of Truth was not a theology to be argued over. It was an invitation to take seriously the experience that most people have been taught to discount, the experience of not quite belonging to the ordinary world, the experience of sensing in certain moments of genuine stillness that the depth beneath the surface of things is not empty but full, not absence but presence, not the random noise of a universe without center, but the quiet hum of something oriented and alive. There is a kind of reader who comes to texts like the Gospel of Truth not as an academic exercise, but as an act of recognition. Not reading to learn new information, reading to find the words for something already felt. The text works, when it works, the way a piece of music sometimes works. It does not add something to you. It finds something that was already there and names it, and in the naming, the thing expands slightly, becomes a little more available, a little more present to ordinary awareness. The Gospel of Truth ends, as nearly as we can reconstruct it from the damaged Nag Hammadi manuscripts, with an image of rest. The soul returning to the fullness, the fog fully lifted, the exile over, not with drama, not with the clash of heavens, with the quiet exhale of something arriving home. That exhale, that small release of held breath, is available right now. Not as an achievement, not as a destination reached, as a permission given. The fog, after all, was never the whole of what is. Let your breath reflect that. Let the next exhale be a small, unremarkable, unhurried return. Chapter 29. Silence before creation. We keep returning to silence, not because silence is simply the absence of sound, but because in the Gnostic vision, silence is a name for the nature of the first principle. Before the Pleroma, before the eons, before the names and the attributes and the emanations, there was silence, not the silence of emptiness, the silence of the absolutely complete. A completeness so full that it had no need to announce itself, no need to make sound, no need to be heard. It simply was. And in a particular form of deep quiet, not manufactured, not achieved through technique, but the organic quiet that sometimes descends in the last hour of a late night, there is a very faint echo of that original silence. Let your body be still. Let the breath move without effort. Notice the specific quality of the quiet around you right now. The Gnostics spent a great deal of time with silence, not as an end in itself, but as a practice of orientation. If you sit with silence long enough, real silence, the kind that is not merely the absence of external noise, but the gradual softening of internal noise, something happens. The edges of the personality become less insistent. The story of who you are and what you need and what you have failed to accomplish starts to loosen its grip. And what is left is not nothing. It is something older than the story. Irenaeus, for all his opposition to Valentinus, preserved a remarkable detail. He recorded that Valentinus described the first principle as the one who cannot be named, cannot be comprehended, cannot be contained in any concept. The name he gave most often was Bythos, the depth. Not the deep in the sense of the ocean floor, the deep in the sense of the dimension of reality that is always present but rarely noticed, the depth behind the surface, the ground beneath the ground. That depth is not something you travel to. You are already in it. You have always been in it. The journey of the Gnostic path is not a journey somewhere. It is a journey inward, or rather, a recognition that the inward direction leads to the same place the upward direction does, to the silence before creation, which is somehow paradoxically also the silence in the middle of your own quiet breathing. Right now, there is a quality to the minutes before sleep that resembles this. Not in some shallow, metaphorical way, in the sense that the ordinary structures of consciousness begin to thin, the hard edges between self and world soften, the insistent narrative of the day loses its grip, and what is present in that softening is something that was there before the day began, before the week began, before the year. The Gnostics would say, before you were born, before the descent through the spheres, before the coats, before the first breath, the silence before creation. And the deepest form of rest is not the absence of awareness. It is the return, however briefly, to that silence, the moment when the spark rests in its own nature, without reaching, without striving, without the effort of being anything other than what it always was. Tonight, that is available, right here, in the quiet. Chapter 30, Terror of False Certainty. Let us speak about something the Gnostics understood with unusual clarity, the terror of false certainty, by which I mean the particular fear that belongs to a person who has organized their entire inner world around a story that is starting to crack. The story that says, I know what is real, I know what matters, I know who I am. Most people spend enormous energy maintaining these certainties. Not because they are bad people, but because uncertainty is genuinely uncomfortable, and the world rewards those who project confidence in their own story. But the Gnostics observe something that very few traditions have had the courage to name directly. The certainty itself can be the problem. The Demiurge was certain. He was absolutely certain that he was the highest God, the only God, the supreme principle of existence. His certainty was sincere. It was total, and it was wrong. He had organized the entire world around a misunderstanding. Let your jaw soften. Let the next breath be slow. There is a man who had been a leader in his community for 30 years. He had led with confidence and clarity and conviction, and most of what he had done was genuinely good. But in his 70s, something began to shift. He started noticing the gaps between the map and the territory. The places where his certainties about how the world worked did not quite match the world he was actually living in. He said, the terrifying thing was not discovering I was wrong about some things. It was discovering how much of my identity was built on never being wrong. The Gnostic insight is not be less certain. It is hold your certainties with more humility, because the most dangerous certainty is the certainty that your current understanding is complete, that the level of reality you can currently perceive is the only level there is. The Demiurge could not look up. The Gnostic practice, the practice of gnosis, of recognition, begins precisely with looking up, with the willingness to ask, what if there is more than I currently see? What if the highest principle is not what I have always assumed it to be? What if I am not only what the story says I am? These are not destabilizing questions if you carry them gently. They are liberating questions, because the answer in every case is yes, there is more, and the more is not frightening. It is the light the soul has always been reaching for. Notice, if you will, the particular relief that comes when you let go of needing to be certain, even for a moment. The relief of not having to maintain the story, not having to defend the version of yourself you have been presenting. That relief is not the feeling of losing something, it is the feeling of something loosening. The Archon of false certainty releasing its grip. And in the space it leaves, in the quiet that arrives when the need to know gives way to the willingness to look, something else becomes possible. The kind of seeing the Gnostics called gnosis, not certainty, recognition. Chapter 31, Redemption Without Violence. The Gnostic vision of redemption is one of the most unusual features of the tradition. In many religious frameworks, redemption involves sacrifice, blood, suffering, the cost of wrongdoing. The Gnostics, Valentinus specifically, offered something different. Redemption through recognition, not through punishment, not through making amends for some original failing, but through the simple, radical act of seeing clearly what is. Sophia's longing, which produced the rupture and the exile, is not resolved by punishment. In the Valentinian myth, Sophia is helped. She is restored. She is accompanied by beings sent from the Pleroma to be with her in her distress and to guide her back. The restoration is not violent. It is gentle. It is, in the oldest sense of the word, merciful. And the redemption of the soul follows the same pattern. Not a price paid, not a penalty endured. A recognition offered and received. Let your body be at rest. Let the quiet be complete. The scholar Elaine Pagels, in her book The Gnostic Gospels, wrote something that illuminates this. She described the Gnostic understanding of evil not as rebellion against God, but as something closer to inadvertence, to the consequences of ignorance, to the cascading effects of a fall that was not intended, not willed, not chosen. And if the fall was not chosen, then the restoration is not about punishment. It is about illumination, about the gradual brightening of a light that was always there, always real, always connected to the source. This has implications for how you hold your own history, the mistakes you have made, the moments where your longing outreached your wisdom, the times you built your world around a story that turned out to be incomplete. In the Gnostic frame, these are not sins requiring punishment. They are moments of the Sophia pattern playing out in a human life. The reaching that went slightly wrong, the love that lost its bearing, and the response of the highest principle is not anger. It is the sending of help. The thread is always there. The path back is always open. And the recognition that the path exists is itself the beginning of the walk. Hold your own history with a little more of this quality tonight. The things you have gotten wrong. The ways your longing outreached your wisdom. The Gnostics would not ask you to feel guilty about them. They would ask you to see them clearly. See the Sophia pattern in them, the love that reached without the wisdom to guide it, and then see what came after. Because Sophia was not abandoned in her exile. The myth says help was sent, and the help was enough. The Sophia pattern in your life has not ended in permanent exile. Whatever you have been through, whatever the reach that went wrong has cost you, the path back is open. It was never closed. Chapter 32, The Soul After Forgetting. Now, let us practice. Let us pause here for a moment, not to meditate, not to fix anything, just to notice. Right now, your body is holding you. You do not have to do anything for that to be true. Let your attention move to wherever your body feels heaviest. Maybe your legs, maybe your hands, maybe the back of your head against the pillow. There is nothing to change. Just notice. Now, let your breath find its own rhythm. You do not need to make it deeper or slower. Just let it move the way it wants to move. The soul after forgetting, the soul in exile, is not without resources. It has the spark. It has the thread that connects it, however thinly, to the Pleroma. It has, in the Gnostic understanding, the specific gift of this moment. the moment when the noise of the day has quieted, when the demands of the ordinary world have loosened their grip, when something deeper becomes just slightly more available. If your mind is busy, that is fine. You do not need to quiet it. Just let it be busy in the background, like a conversation in another room. For these next few moments, your only task is to feel the weight of your own body, to notice that you are here, that you are breathing, that beneath the story of your day, and beneath the story of your year, and beneath the whole accumulated story of your life, something is present, something that is not the story. The Gnostics called it the spark, but it does not need a name. You may have felt it before. In certain moments of unusual quiet, on a long walk, in the minutes after a difficult conversation, when something resolved. In the middle of the night sometimes, when everything else falls away and something simple and clear is what remains. That is the thing the Gnostics were pointing toward. Not the concept, the experience. And it is available here, in this stillness, in the quiet of this particular night. Let your body sink a little deeper into rest. Notice the place where your hands are resting, the place where your head meets what is beneath it, the small, consistent movement of the breath. None of this requires effort. You are already doing it. The soul, after forgetting, does not need to remember everything at once. It needs only one moment of recognition, one brief clearing of the fog, one instant where the coat feels like a coat rather than a skin. That is enough to orient the compass. That is enough to feel, however faintly, the direction home. And the soul that has felt the direction home even once, even for a moment, is never quite the same. The Gnostics knew this. They organized their entire community around the preservation and deepening of that one moment of recognition. Everything else, the cosmology, the rituals, the secret names, was in service of that one thing, the spark seeing itself. And what it sees, when it finally sees clearly, is that it was never in exile from anything except its own recognition. The Pleroma was always here. You were always in it. The forgetting was never the whole of the story. And when you are ready, we will continue. Chapter 33, Beyond Judgment and Law. One of the most radical aspects of Valentinian teaching, and one of the reasons it provoked such fierce opposition, was its position on law. In many religious systems, the divine is understood primarily as the source of law, of commands, commandments, judgments, of a moral order that must be obeyed. For Valentinus, this was the Demiurge's god. The god of law and command and judgment was not the highest principle. The highest principle did not give commands. It did not judge. It simply was. And its being was the ground of everything. This is an extraordinary claim. It means that your relationship to the deepest reality is not one of obedience, not one of being evaluated and found adequate or inadequate. It is a relationship more fundamental than any of that. It is the relationship of a wave to the ocean that generates it. The ocean does not judge the wave. The ocean simply is, and the wave simply is, and they are, at the deepest level, the same thing. Let your breath move softly. Notice the stillness. This does not mean that ethics is irrelevant. The Gnostics were not teaching that behavior does not matter. They were teaching that the ground of ethics is not fear of judgment. It is recognition of what you share with everything else that has the spark. When you see clearly that the person in front of you carries the same light that you carry, when you recognize the spark in another, your behavior toward them changes. Not because you are obeying a law, because you see, this is perhaps the most beautiful aspect of the Gnostic vision. A world not held together by external command, but illuminated from within. Every being carrying a piece of the same fire. Every fire pointing toward the same source. The ethics that flows from that recognition is not rule-following. It is something closer to love. The word the Gospel of Truth uses is impossible to translate without loss. But it reaches toward something like the joy of the belonging that has been recovered. The joy of knowing that what separated you from everything else was only the fog. And the fog, in the end, was never the truth. Think about the people in your life toward whom you feel this kind of recognition. Not the people you are obligated to love. Not the people whose goodness you approve of. The people in whose presence you feel, somehow, that you and they are made of the same thing. That the distance between you is less real than it appears. The Gnostics would say that feeling is accurate. It is not sentiment, it is perception, the perception of the spark recognizing itself in another lamp. The same fire burning in a different shape. And the ethics that flows from that recognition, the particular quality of care that arises when you truly see another person, is not the product of law. It is the product of light. Chapter 34. When the last Archon fades. We are moving now toward the end of our journey tonight. The end of the cosmological story. And the end of what we can usefully say in words. In the Gnostic eschatology, the vision of the final resolution, there is a point at which all the sparks have returned to the Pleroma. All the souls that carried the divine light through the world below have completed their journey upward. The Demiurge still exists, but his domain is empty. The Archons still guard their spheres, but there is nothing to guard. The world of matter still turns, but the animating light has gone. And then, in the fullness of completion, the material world dissolves. Not violently, not catastrophically, quietly. The way a dream dissolves when you wake up. And the last thing to fade is the last Archon, the last limiting power, the last self-appointed authority that thought it was God. And it does not burn, it does not fight, it simply becomes irrelevant, because without the souls it was imprisoning, it has no purpose. It was only a limit, and limits require something to limit. When the last spark has found its way home, The last Archon has nothing left to hold. Let your body be completely at rest. Let your breath be as soft as it wants to be. There is something almost funny about the Gnostic vision of evil's end. Not a great battle, not a dramatic triumph, just dissolution, the cage dissolving because the bird has flown. And the Pleroma, the fullness, receiving back everything that was always its own. The eons in their pairs, the sparks restored to their original nature. Sophia, finally, at rest. And the highest principle, the silence before creation, unchanged through all of it, as it always was, as it will always be, not beginning, not ending, just present. The last Archon fades, and what remains is what always was, the fullness, the silence, the light. And here is the thing about this vision that speaks to something beyond cosmology. In your own inner life, there are Archons that have held their position for a very long time. The voice of self-doubt, the habit of self-diminishment, the assumption that you are fundamentally less than what you sense yourself to be. These are the Archons of the inner world. They have had their authority. They have not been your highest truth. And there is a point in every serious interior life where the last of them fades. Not through force, not through the exhausting work of arguing with yourself, but through the quieter and more powerful work of simply seeing them for what they are, limited beings. Not the voice of the highest principle. And as they fade, not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually over years of honest attention, what remains is the spark in its own nature, clear, real, connected, home. Chapter 35, Resting in the Fullness. We have been traveling a long way tonight, through the invisible layers of a universe imagined by a man who sat nearly 2,000 years ago in the city of Rome and dared to ask the oldest questions. What is real? Where do we come from? What is this persistent feeling that the world is not entirely what it appears to be? And where does the soul go when the world is done with it? Valentinus answered these questions not with certainty, but with images, with stories, with a vision of the cosmos that was beautiful and strange, and, in its essential movement, oriented toward one thing: return. Everything in the Gnostic universe is moving toward return. Sophia returning from her exile. The souls returning through the spheres. The sparks returning to the fullness from which they came. The movement of all of it is homeward. Let your body be still. Let the breath come and go. Let your mind be as quiet as it can be. Resting in the fullness is not an achievement. It is not a state you earn by thinking the right thoughts or believing the right things. It is, in the Gnostic understanding, the natural condition of the spark when the noise of the forgetting has quieted enough for the spark's own nature to be felt. You have been settling into that quiet all evening. You are in it now. This is what the 7-day path we are about to close the evening with is designed to tend, not to create something that is not already there, but to clear a little space. Return gently to the thread that connects you to the Pleroma, to practice in small daily moments the art of recognition. Day 1. Notice one coat. Today, just notice one layer of the self that is not quite the self. One role you are playing, one story you are telling about who you are. You do not need to remove it. You do not need to judge it. Just notice, this is something I wear, and beneath it, something else is here. That noticing, just the noticing, nothing more, is the beginning of gnosis. You might do it on your morning commute. You might do it in the mirror. You might do it in the middle of a conversation when you catch yourself performing rather than speaking. Just notice. And let the noticing be enough for today. Day 2. Find the spark in the quiet. At some point today, find 2 minutes of genuine quiet. Not just the absence of sound, but the softening of internal noise. Sit with it, even briefly, and see what, if anything, is present beneath the usual commentary. You are not looking for a vision or a mystical experience, just a quality, just the sense of something simple and real that does not need to perform. If nothing particular arrives, that is fine too. The willingness to look is the practice. The gap between one thought and the next is where the spark waits. Day 3. See the spark in another. Look carefully at one person today. Not to evaluate them, not to compare, but to try to see beneath the coat they are wearing, the thing that is carrying the coat. The tired eyes of a colleague hiding a person who is also trying to find their way. The careful face of a stranger concealing a life as complex and searching as your own. The spark in another is the same spark as yours. Notice if that recognition changes anything in how you move toward them, even slightly, even briefly. Day 4. Name an Archon. Today, identify one voice in your head that has been passing itself off as truth when it is actually only power. One assumption that operates like a law. One judgment that arrives automatically and that, when you look at it closely, does not hold up to the light. You do not need to defeat it, just name it. Give it a name the way the Gnostic initiates named the Archons at the gates. I see you. I know what you are. You are not the voice of the highest principle. You are a limited power that I have given too much of my energy to. Day 5. Sit with the Archon. If you feel at any point today that particular kind of longing that has no object, the grief for a place you have never been, the here-I-eth for something you cannot name, do not try to resolve it or medicate it or distract yourself from it. Sit with it for 1 minute, just one. It is, in the Gnostic frame, Sophia's longing alive in you, the reaching of the spark toward the fullness it came from. Let it be what it is. Let it be the compass it is. And notice, if you can, that the aching itself is proof of connection. Only something that remembers the Pleroma could ache for it. Day 6. Let the fog thin. The Gospel of Truth describes the moment of recognition as fog lifting. You cannot force fog to lift, but you can stop adding to it. Today, notice one place where you are maintaining a certainty that is more habit than truth, where you are insisting on a story that might benefit from some air. A belief about yourself that you have held so long you have forgotten to question it. A way of understanding something that has been convenient but not complete. You do not need to abandon the story. Just loosen it slightly. Let a little light in. The fog does not need to be conquered, just thinned. Day 7. Rest in the fullness. Tonight, before sleep, lie still for a few minutes with no agenda, no practice, no trying. Just let your body be held, let your breath be whatever it is. And allow the possibility, just the possibility, you do not need to believe it or achieve it, that beneath everything you are carrying tonight, beneath everything you have become over the decades, something is present that was there before any of it. Something that has never been in exile. Something that is quietly and completely at home. You do not need to find it. You cannot lose what you already are. Let tonight be a small practice of allowing it to show itself in the quiet. A small rehearsal of the return that is, in the Gnostic vision, always already happening. Chapter 36. A quiet return to light. We began this evening in a particular kind of quiet. The quiet of a room settling, the quiet of a mind at the edge of rest, the quiet of someone who has lived enough years to know that the questions that matter most are rarely answered by more activity or more noise. We asked, at the beginning, what if the world we see is not the world that is? And now, many hours later, we can hold that question differently, not as a source of anxiety, not as a reason for paralysis, but as an invitation to notice the layers, to look past the surface gently without forcing, to develop the Gnostic quality of seeing that distinguishes between what is powerful and what is real, between what is given to you by the world and what was present in you before the world had a chance to say anything. We also asked, very early in the evening, what are the two kinds of tiredness? You know the answer now. The first kind is the tiredness of the body. Muscles, effort, the accumulated weight of a day. The second is the tiredness of the soul that has been seeking fullness in the world of deficiency. The tiredness of decades of searching in the wrong direction. The tiredness of the spark that knows, in some chamber too deep for ordinary words, that the Pleroma is real and that it has not yet found its way home. That second tiredness is not a failure. It is the most honest thing the soul can feel, and the Gnostic answer to it is not more seeking, it is recognition. The recognition that the thread to the Pleroma was never severed, that the exile was always provisional, that the spark within you is as real and as untouched as it was before the first descent through the Archon's spheres. Valentinus was buried under history for 16 centuries. His texts were hidden in a clay jar in the Egyptian earth. And then they came back. That story does not require us to find it miraculous, but it does invite us to notice something. Ideas that carry genuine light are not easily extinguished. The things that are most real are not the most fragile. The spark persists, even when it is hidden, even when it is forgotten, even when the clay jar has been sealed for 1600 years. Let your body be completely at rest now. Let the breath be as soft as a tide. Let the noise of this day, all of it, everything that pressed on you, everything that demanded, everything you are still turning over in your mind, let all of that be like the Archon whose sphere you have passed through. Real in its way, powerful in its way, but not the whole of what you are. The spark does not require the day's noise to know itself. It knows itself in exactly this quality of quiet, in the particular stillness that arrives when everything else has at last relented. There is a thread connecting you to the Pleroma, not as a metaphor, not as a comfort, as the Gnostics understood it, as the most literal and fundamental fact of your existence. You are not only here, you are more than here. And the more than here is not distant. It is the ground of this very moment, the silence beneath the silence, the light behind the light, the fullness that was present before the world began, and will be present after everything that was built with imperfect hands has at last dissolved into the quiet. Let this night be easy. Let this moment be enough. Let whatever you were carrying when you arrived here tonight be, for now, laid down. You are held, not by the Demiurge, not by the Archons, by something that made the Demiurge and the Archons possible without knowing them, without needing them, without being contained by them, by the silence before creation, by the light that is the source of every spark, by the fullness that was never lost, only for a time forgotten. Sleep now.